Good morning, U.S. history students. Today we're going to be doing notes 4.3 World War II Abroad. Your essential question: how did minority contributions help the United States become successful in World War II? So, just a little recap for us from last week. Remember, the United States was staying out of World War II. We were isolationist. We were deciding that these issues around the world were not the problem of the United States. We did stop selling war materials to Japan, which angered Japan, and we secretly were working with the British to destroy the Nazis. So eventually, we did get drawn into the war on December 7th, 1941. Remember, a day which will live in infamy. That was when Pearl Harbor, Hawaii was attacked. Our military base was attacked, and we lost over 2,000 citizens. So then the United States declares war on Japan, Germany declares war on us, and we declare war back on Germany. So we are officially a part of the war. So there was propaganda to get American citizens to buy war bonds, to participate in the war, to fight against the Nazis. Remember, these are the two major sides of the war. We have the Axis powers, so that's Germany, Italy, and Japan, and they're fighting against the Allies. That's the United States, England, France, and actually all of these other countries as well. So Belgium, Canada, China, Mexico, the Soviet Union, Poland, the Netherlands, all of these countries joined together to fight against the Nazis. So this is German control in Europe and Japanese control over in Asia. They're taking over massive amounts of land. So the leaders on the Allies side, we have the big three. We have England, the United States, and the Soviet Union. So Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. We weren't a big friend of Stalin, but Stalin was also an enemy of the Nazis, so we considered it the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Axis powers, on the other hand, they have Mussolini in Italy, they have Hitler in Germany, and they have Tojo in Japan. Some of our famous military leaders of the time: George Patton would fight the Battle of the Bulge. Dwight Eisenhower would be in charge of D Day. And General MacArthur would lead our military through the South Pacific. So, this is how the country was laid out sort of towards the beginning of the war, 1942. This is the Axis powers here in purple. And you can see they spread immediately. They were spreading all over Europe into Africa. The Axis powers are really taking over that region. So our goal was to attack from Africa. We were going to go into Africa first, and we were going to attack what we called Hitler's soft underbelly. We were going to go in through Italy and attack to try to divide the empire here. So in 1942, we go into North Africa. Remember, we did join the war after we got attacked in December of 1941. So we help by starting in Africa and moving our way north. 1943, the Soviet Union, remember, is fighting the Nazis in that Battle of Stalingrad. And that was a very deadly battle against the Nazis and the Russians when they went and they surrounded the capital city of Stalingrad during the winter. So George Patton led the American troops up through Africa and across the Mediterranean into Italy. The Allies were able to liberate Rome by 1944, and they did this by the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen were the first black pilots to fight in the US military. So they had a very impressive fighting record, and they helped lessen the racism towards African Americans. They received a ton of medals for fighting in the war, and there's two movies that are made about them: Red Tails and the Tuskegee Airmen. They were called the Tuskegee Airmen because they were trained in Tuskegee, Alabama. There was almost 1,000 pilots that were trained there in Tuskegee, Alabama from 1940 to 1946, and almost 500 of them were deployed overseas to fight in the war. President's wife, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, she flew an hour with the African American pilots, and she helped to convince her husband that they needed to be used to their full potential, that they were fully capable of fighting in the war. Meanwhile, we have to mention the Holocaust was going on during World War II. This you covered extensively in your world history classes, but we can't talk about World War II without mentioning it even in US history. So, the Holocaust was Hitler's final solution for what he called the Jewish problem. So, in the Holocaust, there was over 6 million people that were killed. They was the majority of Jewish people that were killed, but they also killed Roma people. They killed um, people who were considered to be mentally handicapped at the time. They killed anyone who was LGBT at the time, and they put them into these concentration camps. Most of these concentration camps were in Eastern Europe. You can see here the red dots there were the concentration camps throughout Europe. It was one of the most horrific acts of genocide in the world history that we know. Hitler forced these people to work in slave labor producing products for the Nazis and starved them and brutally tortured them. They dug mass graves. And unfortunately, the horrors weren't widely known until the camps were liberated by the Allied troops. They had flown over and they had taken some pictures, but they didn't really know what was happening until they got there on the ground. And they discovered over 6 million people had been murdered. Meanwhile, in the United States, we also had camps. These were called internment camps, not the same thing as a concentration camp like they were having in Europe. So, these Japanese internment camps were the forced relocation and incarceration of between 110 and 120,000 people. These people were of Japanese ancestry, but 62% of these people were US citizens. They were born in the United States, they had moved here and become US citizens, and they were forced to sell their businesses, their homes, they lost their jobs. They were only allowed to pack up the belongings that they could take in a suitcase. They were forced to be relocated because they were seen as a threat. In 1988, the United States government did apologize for this and paid a $20,000 to each survivor, but this was in 1988. Okay, so they had been interned in the 1940s. Many of the people who had been interned lost their businesses, lost their homes, lost their livelihoods. They had already passed away, unfortunately. They did apologize. The government's actions were based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership. Remember, we weren't just fighting the Japanese in World War II, we were also fighting the Germans and we were also fighting the Italians. But we didn't put Germans or Italians into internment camps, just Japanese people. And that was based strictly on racial prejudice. So, this is what the internment camps looked like. They were forced into these homes. It would be like a one-room home for your entire family. But while we still had the war raging, we had the 442nd Regiment. And this was when the military, during World War II, it was still segregated based on race. So this was the 442nd Regiment was built up of over 17,000 Japanese men who volunteered to go fight in the war. This is while their people were being interned, being forced into these prison camps. They still volunteered to fight for our country. Over 1,200 of them signed up to volunteer to go and fight in the war directly from the relocation camps. They helped liberate some of the concentration camps in Europe and helped defeat the Nazis. Women were also involved in the war, so women signed up to serve in the military, although they couldn't serve in combat roles. There was plenty of positions in the military that they could serve. Women were a part of the WAVES, the Women for Volunteer Emergency Services, the WACs and the WASPs, the Women Army Corps, the Women Air Force Service Pilots. The WASPs actually flew the airplanes over to Europe. So all the planes that we had over there, women were flying these planes over the ocean to get to Europe, and then they handed off the planes to the soldiers that would use them to fight. They flew over 60 million miles in every type of military aircraft, but they weren't actually granted veteran status until 1977, and it wasn't until March of 2016, just 4 years ago, that Congress let them be buried at the Arlington National Cemetery. Women also served as ambulance drivers. They decoded messages. In the Soviet Union, they were actually allowed to be bomber pilots, excuse me, and Hitler actually called them the night witches. And then, of course, women worked in the industrial jobs during World War II. So they were building ships, they were building planes, building weapons. Rosie the Riveter was the icon that encouraged women to go join that war effort. Meanwhile, in Europe, Alan Turing invented this new machine that they end up calling the Turing machine. So, this machine actually broke the German military codes. He built a machine that would break these codes by identifying what their mixed messages were going to be every single day. The Enigma machine was developed in Germany shortly after World War I to encode and decode messages, and for the next 20 years, the German military refined their technology, and it became their primary way to send messages during World War II. So it was very important that we broke this code so we would know what the Germans were planning on doing each day. But unfortunately, he was an LGBTQ man, so after the war was over, he was actually arrested for the crime of being gay. Yes, that was a crime in Europe during the 1940s. So when he was arrested for this crime, he was given the choice of either spending a year in prison or allow himself to be treated with an experimental hormone to fix his sexual orientation. Okay, fix this in quotations because there's no way to fix someone's sexual orientation. So he went ahead and tried the treatment, and he was permanently disqualified from doing any more government code breaking work. Unfortunately, a year later, he would commit suicide by taking a lethal dose of cyanide, and he was only 42 years old. He did help, however, the Allies to win the war in Europe. So the Allied powers, eventually, after the war was over, would become known as the United Nations, and the Germans would have to surrender to them when the war would be over in 1945. We're going to switch gears now, focus on Asia. So I remember we got involved in the war on December 7th, 1941, when Japan flew over to Hawaii, took their ships over to Hawaii, and attacked our Air Force base. I'm sorry, our naval base that was there. So here on this map, you can see where Japan is, and you can see where Hawaii is. Alaska's up at the top, and we have the west coast of California somewhere over here. So the United States did end up declaring war on Japan, and we really get involved in this conflict in the Pacific in 1942. So the US and the Filipino troops were fighting against the Japanese together. They were not doing so well in the Philippines. They were forced to march 60 miles and several thousand died along the way. This was their march that they had to complete. The actual deaths are unknown, but they're anywhere between 6,000 and 18,000 deaths in 1942. So the military leaders over in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur was leading our Navy and our Air Force over there in Asia. In 1942, we would have a bunch of battles here on these islands, the Battle of Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway. We destroyed a lot of their naval ships through these battles, and our strategy was to do island hopping. So, as you can see, there's a lot of tiny little dots on this map. All of those are islands. So, we were going from Hawaii, we were hopping over here to Midway, and our plan was to hit all of the islands along the way until eventually we got to Japan. After we had been attacked at Pearl Harbor in 1941, our response was the Doolittle raids. So our plan was to bomb Tokyo and land in China. We were going to bomb all the factories in Tokyo that were creating war materials. On April 18th, 1942, the bombs fell on Tokyo. Japan was very surprised by this attack. They didn't expect us to come and attack their cities. This would lead us to continue to have conflicts in the Pacific. So the Battle of Midway was a very bloody battle that we had in the Pacific. Japan lost over 100 pilots, which hurt their air force a lot during that time. And we would use the Navajo to help us win the war over in the Pacific. So the Navajo are a group of Native Americans that are from the New Mexico and Arizona region of the United States. So just like the Nazis were coming up with their own secret code, we had to come up with our own secret code as well, just in case the Japanese could hear what we were talking about. So the Navajo language doesn't have an alphabet or any symbols. It's a spoken language. So it's complex, it's very difficult to learn. It's estimated that fewer than 30 non Navajo people in the world actually speak their language. So the military recruited 29 Navajo men to come and be code talkers for the military. Eventually, this would turn into over 400 code talkers to work in the Pacific campaign. So they were able to transmit messages very quickly. They transmitted over 800 messages over 2 days without error. If they were captured, they were asked by the Japanese to interpret the code, and they could interpret the code. They could translate it into English for them, but it still didn't make any sense. And I'll give you an example on the next slide of what this code would look like. So their code was actually classified information until 1968. So after the war was over, they weren't seen as heroes. They weren't honored. Nobody really knew what they did until 1968 because they were still keeping them secret in case they had to use that code again, even after the war was over. They eventually did become honored at the Pentagon, at the White House, were given medals for their contributions to the war effort. So this is an example here of the Navajo code. So in Navajo, we have the language here in the middle. The English translation would be America attack. I'm sorry. In English, it would be America attack a submarine, and then in Navajo, this is the language here, and then the literal translation. So if one of the Navajo men were caught and they were asked to translate the message, the literal message would be "Our mother attack iron fish." So it was very complicated for the Japanese to understand what does "Our mother attack iron fish" mean, but for them, that meant that we were attacking a submarine. So they were able to help us win a lot of the war in the Pacific by having these decoded messages. So we would continue our island hopping strategy, getting closer and closer to Japan as the time went on. Towards the end of the war, when the Japanese knew they were losing, the Japanese started encouraging their pilots to use these kamikaze strategies. So, the last 2 years of the war, the Japanese resorted to being suicide bombers. So, these kamikaze bombers would take their planes and they would shoot everything that they could. They would drop all their bombs, they would shoot everything out of their guns, and then they would use the plane to crash into ships. So, they would be killing themselves in the process, but with the purpose of taking down a ship. So as the war progresses, 1944, 1945, we're getting closer and closer to the island of Japan. 1945, we're right here at Iwo Jima. This puts us within 500 miles of Japan. So as you can see, we started out in Hawaii and we have moved all the way up here, very close to where Japan is. You may have seen this statue before. It was based on this picture. There's a statue in Washington, D.C. This is from the Battle of Iwo Jima. And the Navajo code talkers helped us to win that battle at Iwo Jima. There's a movie based off that called Wind Talkers as well. So the big three meet. We have Churchill, we have Truman. Truman would take over after FDR passes away. And we have Stalin meeting in Germany in July of 1945. They demanded unconditional surrender from the Japanese, or they would use a new weapon on the Japanese. So in this conference, some suggest that President Truman was warning Stalin, like, hey, just so you know, we also have this weapon, so don't make us use it against you. We had victory in Europe. VE Day would be on May 25th, 1945. So we could focus all of our efforts now on Japan. The war was over in 1945, May of 1945 in Europe, so we could focus all our efforts on Japan. And we will get into the end of the war later on. This is the end of your notes for today, though, so don't forget to write a summary, a couple sentences about what you learned.